Well, thanks very much, Michael, for having me back again this year, and thanks, Graham, for that great warm-up, for that scene setting. I'm going to come from a slightly different angle, but hopefully a bit more information to add to the various views around where we're at with mobility as a service. So ITS Australia, so firstly I'll give you a bit of a background about us and who we are. Whoops. Take us in the right direction. So ITS Australia, we're the peak body for advanced transport technology in Australia. We represent government, industry and academic institutions and aim to collaborate together amongst the transport ecosystem to bring informed debate around the transport technology and aim to create opportunities and also work with our international peers to look at exploring opportunities for Australian businesses internationally, but also bring that international expertise into the Australian marketplace. And over the last year, we've been working on a project on mobility as a service to really look at for those that you are interested in this space, there's many studies on mobility as a service. It certainly is, sort of up the top of that hype curve at the moment. And there's lots of studies and lots of information about how that might play out in different environments. But there's actually not a lot of information about where we're at in Australia and what in particular Australians think and what might work in Australia. So we undertook to sort of try and fill that gap to understand how we might take it forward in Australia to get the benefits for the Australian community in that space. We were really pleased to work with government agencies from across Australia, so Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, WA, and in South Australia we had RAA as the representative from the government on the panel. And we worked with stakeholders both within Australia and also a number of international stakeholders that were able to add a bit of information around where we're at with MAS and what some of the issues and challenges might be. So what we looked at, we sort of looked at a number of stages through this project. The first one was really just to get a snapshot and an understanding of where things were at internationally. There are a number of deployments underway, where are we at and what's happening internationally. Talking to a number of stakeholders within Australia to understand what the views were on what might work from some of the experts and some of the stakeholders in that space. And then also look at the so what's for Australia and what were the opportunities and what were some of the challenges to be overcome. So one of the early things we did, and everyone likes to do this when they start a new study, is to look at their own definitions. So we added to the vast knowledge of definitions on MAS. So for those that you're going to hear a bit of that in the next few speakers. So we saw MAS as offering consumers access to a range of different transport options through a number of different suppliers through one platform. It gave them a booking system on the platform. It gave them the opportunity to look at different transport options to link together an end-to-end journey from their origin right through to their destination. And also gave a payment option and the option to choose your different journeys. So that what we saw was that there are a range of options in operation around the world at the moment. And these have different scales and different extents. So some of them are quite small geographically. They're being rolled out in a small rural town in France, through to some of them being much bigger in their extent of operation, but maybe not covering the same modes of transport or maybe not offering an end-to-end payment system. So there are different solutions being rolled out around the world at the moment. It's definitely more than a concept. We're definitely seeing them being deployed in different countries and regions, seeing certainly different challenges in different geographic regions. So some of the feedback from Europe at the moment, for example, is that if we want to roll out a MAS service that gives an end-to-end transport solution, ideally we want to cover kind of a 4-hour patch, because that might be, someone might travel 4 hours in a particular day. That might be their transport corridor. And in Europe, you might be covering 3 or 4 different countries, so that creates quite a level of complexity. So Australia is seen as quite an attractive place for some of these international operators. There's a lot of interest in people looking around, and I know Didi have recently just launched in the Australian marketplace with a formal launch to take place in a few weeks' time. So there's a lot of interest internationally in what the Australian marketplace might be, because they see that as a market that's ready to take up this technology and perhaps an easier deployment than some of our overseas counterparts. And I think we're going to hear also later about some of the interesting deployments taking place in New Zealand as well. Some of the other things we saw was on-demand transport being seen as an interesting path forward into mass. So whether it might be one or the other, or possibly on-demand transport, whereby you get the vehicle, not so much a taxi, but a bus service that comes to you when you need it, or closer to where you are and closer to when you need it, than a traditional timetabled bus service. So that as potentially a pathway to mass, or to complement and supplement existing transport services. So really, I guess the message here is there's no need to reinvent the wheel. There are a range of solutions being offered already around the world, being tested and tried. And what we've done in our report is try to consolidate that information so you can sort of get a flavour for some of the services that are around there, to see what might eventually be rolled out in the Australian context. So as I said, we started off by speaking to stakeholders, to the experts, if you like, and some of the bus industry people and some of the universities and a whole range of stakeholders to understand their views on what they saw as the challenges, the opportunities, and some of the governance issues. Very much the overwhelming view was, with this convergence of technologies, whether it be the automation of vehicles, the connectivity and the ability to plan out your journey on a device, we are seeing the next biggest revolution in transport since the start of the automobile. So we can expect an exciting ride ahead, and we can certainly expect change. As to exactly how that plans out, I don't think anyone quite knows, but this is a bit of a flavour for what we might see. Some of the challenges that were raised is around data standards and interoperability, so trying to make sure if we're all going to be connected, how do we get that connectivity and those data standards? The whole sharing factor, how do we make sure that people aren't in these vehicles on their own, and coming out, we've heard some of those challenges this morning around the population growth, the increased urbanisation of our population, and then people's natural tendency to be in vehicles on their own if they have that choice. How do we counter some of that to make sure we get the outcomes that we want, and we make sure that we've got livable cities and communities? The challenges of commercial considerations, balancing this whole ecosystem, and then of course the privacy and security concerns. So overall, we think there's a real need for interoperability, and the open access of data are some of the challenges that need to be overcome. That then played out, of course, into a significant view on, well, what is the role of government? We've seen traditionally, in the past few years, we see our governments wanting to have a low level of regulation and trying to step back from regulating, leaving things to market forces. When we start to think of some of the outcomes that we might want from our transport systems in the future, leveraging some of this technology, we can start to see where we might want government to play. And there's a lot of thought going in at the moment in government places, state governments, as to where's their role to fit. Can they just leave it to market forces? I think that'd be the natural preference. But is there actually a role for government to play to make sure that we get the transport outcomes and the community outcomes that we're looking for from these changing transport tools? So we also went out and spoke to, did a survey, representative survey of around 4,000 Australians. They represented, it's a representative survey, and we looked at on their particular views. So the people that we spoke to, they were from a mix of regional locations and capital cities. They were all 18 years and older, so I guess we need to be upfront that we didn't survey the transport needs of people under 18, but perhaps they're a little bit reflected in the answers that we got from the adults that we surveyed. 90% of people were licensed drivers. They typically have 1.6 vehicles per household. 13% of them owned a motorcycle. 9%, interestingly enough, used a mobility device of some sort. 5% of them using walking sticks. One of the interesting early findings, we wanted to, there's a few myths around there about how much it actually costs for you to get around. So we asked people around what they thought their transport costs were. And similar to what you might have heard in other studies elsewhere, people considerably underestimated their cost of transport. What we know it costs them to run a car, people considerably underestimated that. And one of the interesting findings we had was that those that were more able to accurately estimate their cost of transport were much more prepared to look at a mass or mobility as a service type solution. So there was a direct correlation between people's understanding of their actual transport costs and then their preparedness to pay for an improved or a better service. So what were people looking for? It was interesting to see that the modes that people were most used to using were driving, walking and public transport, so they were the most preferred modes. So certainly people see public transport as an integral part of how they get around. The unpopular modes to be included in a bundle, when we offered people different bundles, were car rental. They're like, oh no, not too interested in that. Car sharing, there wasn't a high demand for car share services. And bike sharing was down the bottom of the list. So we don't have a particularly bike sharing community or community looking for bike share as part of a package of options when they're looking at their transport needs. When we asked them about how did you want to pay for a sort of all-in-one mobility service, overwhelmingly people wanted to pay as they go. So, while there's talk internationally around, a sort of an all-you-can-eat option, you pay a fixed price per month and you get, as much transport as you can use. And there are certainly some of those mass options out there, including taxis to your holiday house on the weekend. But, you've got to pay a few €100 a month, up to €1,000 a month for that sort of service. So in Australia, people were thinking that, we don't want to pay a fixed price, we just want to give it a go and we want to pay for the service as we use it. So we think that's sort of quite a low-risk approach, both for the community and also for the transit sector as we look to move into a wider choice and a range of options in this area. The other interesting thing that we found was around we asked people what sort of trips do you think you would use in this mobility as a service space? And people were much more inclined to use it for a social trip or an outing rather than a routine transport need. So I think that reflects positively for those in the room that are providing general commuter services to people. They're pretty comfortable with the way they're getting to and from their place of work and those routine transport modes. People are pretty happy with that. And so they saw trying something new was something that they would do, for a trip that maybe it didn't matter too much if they were a bit late or if it didn't work properly. Or maybe it was just that they wanted to leave the car at home because they wanted to have a drink. We didn't drill down to the whys, but it was a social trip that people were most inclined to use for this, for them to be their first trip. We also looked at the personas, so we looked at sort of categories of people that would be most likely to use these services versus those that were least likely. So we had, top of the list was our personalisers, so these were tertiary educated, they had a quite high disposable income, working or living in either regional or city areas, so there wasn't sort of a tight definition in that. Quite high transport needs, and these people also had a good understanding of their transport costs. Socialisers, these were more middle-aged, tended to be more women, tended to have a positive view of public transport and a sort of a not such positive view on need to own your own car, so perhaps not surprising that they're more inclined to move into a public transport space. Right through to those at the lower end that were like, no, I'm welded to my car, I can't imagine getting around any other way. Public transport's so terrible in my environment that, I could never look at public transport as an option. So some interesting trends around that sort of space as well. I'll just briefly step through, step through what we found in terms of some geographies and where people were most inclined. So across Australia there wasn't massive differences. When we looked across Australia we saw that, it was around, when we offered people the services that were most popular, so that's a pay-as-you-go, it's a full service scheme, so it has full planning, full ticketing, full booking and integration, real-time information and the ability to personalise your service. It was around a 45% interest in taking up this sort of a service. So, generally the Australian population are ready to try this service. It was the strongest demand was in New South Wales, just under 50%, down to just over 40% in WA, so sort of fitting in between that, 40 to 50% take up. When we looked at New South Wales, we had reasonable interest in take up in Sydney, with some regional areas also. So we found some really interesting things around regional areas that generally seem to be where there's reasonable level of public transport services. They were looking to supplement that and improve that with a more personalised and customised service. When we drill down into Sydney, we see certainly there's an interest in taking up in inner cities. So this is where people traditionally think these are the cherry-picking opportunities, right in the inner city. What we find, though, is that perhaps these people already almost have a mobility as a service. They've got everything that they could want on their doorsteps right in the inner city areas. But when you move out into the Parramatta's, the southwest West Sydney's, that's where they're seeing gaps in their transport network, and they can see that an enhanced service could encourage them to use a mass product and move away from their cars. So that's where they're looking for an extra service. Down in Victoria, again, we found in some of the regional centres a reasonable level of interest around Bendigo, around Warrnambool and southwestern Victoria. A good level of interest in Melbourne, perhaps not quite as strong though as Sydney. Maybe that's just reflecting the current size of the cities and the ease of getting around as it sits at the moment. What we also found too is that you went further out, so the really outer metropolitan areas, that was where you found the people that were really dependent on cars, and they just couldn't imagine that a mass type service would be there and would ever be able to meet their needs. So there was you needed to have a foundation of public transport access for people to then think about expanding their use of public transport in a mass type environment. So where does that leave us? So it's a little bit small there, but jump online and have a look at our report. So at ITS Australia, we really strongly believe, and the project team strongly believes, that there is a great opportunity through MASS to really bring together use of public transport and use of emerging technology to enhance transport access and transport efficiency and effectiveness. We already have a project team that's been established, so we're going to continue to operate a reference group with representatives of the bus industry sitting on that reference group to look at some of the challenges that we face before we can deploy this and to look at how we can take this further forward. But I think firstly it's really quite important when we look at what some of the transport outcomes could be in this space, that we have a clear vision as to what we're trying to achieve so that we can make sure that we strive towards the vision that we want rather than the outcome that we could get with everyone running around in their own Uber independently. So some of the things that we are looking for is an efficient use and efficient movement of people. So that's not one person per vehicle, that's a shared service. We're looking for a vibrant and competitive industry. So this is not a one player takes it all. This is new players coming in and out, providing niche operators in certain sectors and the opportunity for new players to come in and enter the marketplace. We're looking to build on the existing public transport network. We're looking to enhance transport access across the community and across geographical areas. And we're also looking to make sure that it's inclusive and responsive. And we think to achieve this, we need to make sure that it's an interoperable open access solution that enables that richness of data and information, and also ultimately aims to be more convenient than owning your own car. So these aren't easy targets. They're certainly going to take collaboration before we can get there. But we think that there's some great technology that can move public transport really to the next generation and can really make it that much more beneficial to the community. So you can jump on our website if you'd like more information, and feel free to download a copy of the report. I'll be around at the end of the day if you want to catch up with any more information. So thanks very much, Michael.